an expert, or at least an expert involved in the restoration of some of the buildings present here. I'll just start with introducing how we got to this topic. We are PhD scholars in colonial history, and we oft hear the sentence that it's very important to come to a shared Indonesian-Dutch understanding of our shared past, which is of course also partly troubled. But in practice, we found that there's many hurdles and difficulties in reaching this somewhat lofty goal. We encountered that in our research. And today we will explore a colonial heritage in Jakarta today to also identify some of these hurdles and give some preliminary ideas for improvement. First, let me introduce ourselves a bit more. Philip and I are PhD researchers here at Leiden University, and we study what can be called the colonial ideology of administrators and also preachers, so ministers, in the Moluccas and Batavia in the 18th and early 19th century. And Pak Bondan, hello, he is a lecturer and researcher at the Faculty of Humanities at Universitas Indonesia, and also involved as an expert with projects on the restoration and repurposement of buildings that are colonial heritage. I hope I'm introducing you okay, Bob. And he will explain it more elaborately later on. Today we will talk about colonial heritage, and maybe we can go to the first slide of the PowerPoint. Yes. Philip and I will first give a short introduction, a general introduction on memory culture and practices, and also introduce how we got to this topic. Then Pak Bondan will elaborate on a concrete case study of colonial heritage management. Yeah, and I see that this is the old PowerPoint. I think, Octavia, we sent you the new one. Maybe it can be loaded. I sent it to you 30 minutes ago, but I mean, this is also okay because Pak Bondan will talk about the, if I say it correctly, the Gedung Pancasila instead of these two buildings. But he will introduce that more later on, and we will also present to you the idea of a summer school we have regarding the same subject, colonial heritage, memory culture, practices. And this is still in a preliminary stage, so we're also here because we would love to get your input, feedback, any advice, and maybe also a partnership as well. So we can go to the next slides. The next PowerPoint slides.
You're just loading a new one.
Oh, we're loading a new one. All right. So how we got to this subject is that Philip and I, we do a PhD research on colonial ideology. So we study the narratives that legitimized the Dutch Empire and what the Dutch were doing in Indonesia for 1.5 centuries. Connected to that, of course, we also see and study the narratives that these colonial actors were sending back to the Netherlands, sending back to the metropole about what they were doing and how they were legitimizing what they were doing. And of course, this question is connected to now quite heated public debate in the Netherlands and also public interest regarding the long-term consequences of colonialism, and also the colonial narratives that were used to legitimize colonialism in the Netherlands. If the slide is not ready here, but we see that in literature, we see that in scholarship. For example, one scholar, Gloria Becker, she wrote a book, White Innocence, and she posited that the cultural archive has been formed during centuries of colonialism, which were filled with the narratives that justified colonialism, so also racism and feelings of superiority towards the non-Western world, that still guide and inform Dutch behavior today. So we see that in everyday racism, still feelings of superiority toward the non-Western world. We also see the moral struggling, or the moral struggle over the long-term consequences of colonialism when it comes to apologies from the government or from the Dutch king here in a meeting with Jokowi or in the state visits. And also when it comes to restitution of objects, recently an announcement of 284 objects from Dutch musea to be sent back to Indonesia. So we see that the long-term consequences of colonialism are hotly debated, and this moral question of who's the perpetrator, who's the victim, and how can something be set sort of right or apologies being offered are present in the Dutch public debate and the Dutch mind. Of course, we study what narratives were actually defaulted during centuries of Dutch colonialism to fill this cultural archive, which is now being struggled with, being debated. The next question for us was, what about the other side of the coin? If long-term consequences of these colonial narratives in the Netherlands are everyday racism, for example, feelings of superiority towards the non-Western world, what about the long-term consequences for Indonesia of these narratives? What about the long-term consequences of colonialism and colonial narratives on Indonesian mentalities? And maybe even more important, how is this perceived and being looked at and perhaps debated in Indonesia? And for that, we can go to the next slide. This was a question that's not part of our PhD research, but we started asking this as a side project next to our PhD project, because we found that when we talk to people and sometimes also students, that there seems to be different memory culture and practices. Of course, this can also be found in literature. Sometimes people said it's the past and the future is more important. But we found this an interesting question, these differences. So we organized a meeting with a public lecture with Iksaka Banu, the writer, who does engage with colonial history in his work. And we found that these, maybe compared to Dutch literature, there's also not many Indonesian authors who engage with colonial history, but he does. And we also talked with him about this memory culture, memory practices, these long-term consequences, maybe also of colonialism. And he told us that in his mind, interest in colonial history might have been small for a long time. It's growing now, but it has long been, to a degree, smothered by a dominant narrative that also served nation building, which might have smothered interest and engagement with colonial history that might otherwise have blossomed. But at the same time, he also pointed at certain paradoxes. He said that even though it might seem that there is little engagement, at the same time, there is engagement of young people, and sometimes victimhood is being talked about. There's also often a narrative of national strength that is being posited alongside or in front of colonial history. And he also pointed at another paradox, namely that colonialism is detested, but there's also this tacit reverence for things that are Western. And he mentioned, for example, reverence for a white skin. So he pointed at certain paradoxes that might also have to do with the long-term consequences of colonial narratives that were told. One of his main points was that when one really delves deep into colonial society and history, one finds that colonial society was very complex and in many cases very hybrid. There were many people that were in between the colonial class and local society, or not only in but to some degree in both groups. And you see there were many entanglements. And for example, if you look at class, there are many people in the lower classes, Indo-European, but also local people, that both suffered and both were subjugated. His point was that if we don't put a more nuanced understanding of colonial history, it can help to study colonial history together from an Indonesian-Dutch perspective, because that can help you to get to this more nuanced view, vice versa. if you get a more nuanced view, you realize that both perspectives are important. Let's see, and then we arrived at the incentive for today, namely that we're talking about the shared history, which should also be studied together. And what we present to you is an idea of maybe how to take a partial step to reach that goal, maybe by looking at colonial heritage in Jakarta and also memory, culture, and practices there. Tom Rondan is an expert involved in the restoration of some of these buildings, and will give you his take on the current state of heritage management and also what can be improved in the Indonesian-Dutch academic cooperation. Tom Rondan, floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to share my PowerPoint. Is it possible? Because in my screen is still your PowerPoint. Can I start my PowerPoint now? Yes, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Alex and Felix? Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay, I will continue what Alex already presented, and I will talk about the colonial building as a heritage, the case of Pancasila building. I think this case is very important, especially the Pancasila building, because this building until now is still existed and well preserved. So this is an example how the colonial building maintained and until now still existed because it plays an important role in Indonesian history. Okay, as a city that's experienced development during the colonial period, 17th and 20th century, Jakarta has many heritage buildings. And these buildings were mainly built during the VOC period, 17th and 18th century, and later during the Dutch East Indies period, 19th and 20th century. And after Indonesia independence, many of these colonial buildings were converted or even demolished. The main reason for change in function or demolition is usually economic reason. Most colonial buildings, which are also cultural heritage sites, are located in strategic location with high economical potential. Maintaining colonial building is often costly, as the Jakarta government requires building owners to maintain the condition of the building as much as possible. And meanwhile, the possible of reaping economic benefits from new building in strategic location is seen as more promising. Heritage can be defined as the history, values, and traditions that community has had over the years and is considered an important part of their character. Heritage can also be defined as anything that people want to save, including buildings and other relics. In Jakarta, there are many buildings that have heritage value. And one area that has many heritage buildings, of course, is the old town of the former city of Batavia. In the old town, there are many buildings from the VOC period and from the Dutch East Indies period. And another part of the city of Jakarta that has a lot of heritage is the central Jakarta area, especially the area around Lapangan Banteng or Banteng Field, or the Waterloo Plain area in the Dutch Indies period. In the early 19th century, the Waterloo Plain area was planned to be the center of the Dutch Indies government, and because of this, there are many important buildings that built around these sites, such as Dandel's Palace or Witte Palace, Emmanuel Church, Cathedral Church, a military headquarters, and also the Volkskrant building or the Indies Representative Council. Among the many colonial heritage buildings in Jakarta, most of them are no longer perform the important function they did when they were first built. For example, the Batavia City Hall building, which was the center of the city administration in 17th and 18th century, is located in the Old Town. The building has now been turned into the Jakarta History Museum, which exhibit various collections that illustrate the development of Jakarta history from prehistory to the end of the VOC. Another example is the former VOC Western Warehouse in the northern part of Batavia Old Town. The former warehouse is now converted into a maritime museum that presents collection on the development of Indonesia maritime history. Meanwhile, the former Daniels Palace building in the eastern part of the former Waterloo playing field or Lapangan Banteng, currently part of the Finance Ministry and is undergoing extensive renovation. And one of the heritage building in Jakarta that still perform an important function today is the building that in the Dutch East Indies period was known as the Volkskrant building. And now in Jakarta, this building known as the Pancasila building or Gedung Pancasila. Pancasila or the five basic principle is the philosophy of the nation and state of the Republic of Indonesia. It consists of the five principle, namely the first, God Almighty, second, fair and civilized humanity, the third, Indonesian unity, the fourth, democracy led by wisdom in the deliberation of representatives, and five, social justice for all Indonesian people. The Volkskrant building is located near to the Waterloo field or now in the Gambir area of Jakarta. There is no official record or when exactly the Pancasila building was built. Some literature suggests that it was built in 1930. The building was originally built as the residence of the commander of the Dutch war forces in the Dutch East Indies. And in the early 19th century, the commander residence was moved to Bandung along with the headquarters of the Dutch Indies war force. The former residence of the commander was deemed by the colonial government to be adequate enough to house the Volkskrant. The inauguration of the Volkskrant building was carried out by Governor General van Limburg-Stirum in 1918. The Volkskrant was a council with very limited powers. Initially, the council was only given the right to advise the government. But in 1927, the People's Council was authorized to make laws together with the Governor General. However, these powers were of little importance as the Governor General had a veto right. Between 1942 and 1945, Indonesia was occupied by Japan, and in 1943, the Japanese military government in Indonesia established the Chosangi Central Advisory Board in Jakarta. The body was taken with making proposal to the government and answering the government question on political matters and giving consideration to what action the Japanese military government would take. The first and subsequent session of the Chosangin took place in the formal Volkskrant building. This building continues to change its function. From the end of May to July 1945, this building was used as a meeting place for Indonesia Independent Preparation Investigation Board, or abbreviated as BPUPK. The most important event that took place in the building in the context of Indonesia history occurred on the morning 1st of June 1945 when Sukarno made an hour-long speech in front of the BPUPK members to convey various basic principles that would become the basis of the Indonesia independent state. The basis principle were later known as Pancasila. The important event that took place on June 1st caused the formal Volkskrant building to be better known as the Pancasila building. The important role of the building continued because between July 10 and 17 July 1945, in the same building, the UPK trial was held to draft a constitution that would become the Constitution of Independent Indonesia. The discussion of the Constitution took place based on the draft Constitution that had been prepared by Professor Supomo, which has been then discussed one by one and given various editions by BPUPK members. The result of the discussion then produced the 1945 Constitution, which is the Constitution of the Indonesia Independent State, which together with Pancasila was ratified on August 18, 1945. After Indonesian independence, this building experienced a various moment. During this period, the Pancasila building briefly served as an office for Indonesian government activities between mid-August and late December 1945. And when the Indonesian capital moved to Yogyakarta in 1946-1949, the building was abandoned and used for the benefit of the Netherlands Indies Civil Administration or NICA government, which occupied Jakarta for about 4 years. After Indonesia's sovereignty was recognized by Roundtable Conference on December 27, 1949, the Indonesian government moved to the capital back from Jakarta to Jakarta. And since 1950, Pancasila Building became the office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Towards the implementation of the historic ASEAN African Conference or Konferensi Asia Afrika or KAA, Pancasila Building became the headquarters of activities for the preparation of the conference chaired by the Secretary General of Indonesia Ministry Foreign Affairs with members of the Ambassador of India, Myanmar, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. The name of Pancasila building was also increasingly recognized when on the 1st June 1964, it was commemorated nationally as the birthday of Pancasila. And in effort to meet the expectation of Indonesian people for the maintenance and repair of historic cultural heritage, the restoration of the Pancasila building was carried out by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 1973 to 1975. The restoration of the interior of the building has been attempted as far as possible to restore its original style without making fundamental changes. The restoration was mainly carried out with reference to the condition of the building in 1945. The choice to renovate with the condition in that year with the consideration that at the time this building carried out its most important function. The restoration of the Pancasila building as heritage that occupies an important position in Indonesia history was not only carried out once, but actually several times. And the latest restoration just took place in 2014 and completed this year, 2024. The long period of restoration of building is due to the technical problem related to the lack of information and data on reference to restore the building so that its condition is as close as possible back to 1945. Pancasila building is currently used to hold international events such as a reception in honor of foreign dignitaries visiting Indonesia, signing agreement with other countries and international organizations, bilateral meetings, and also diplomatic reception to welcome visiting foreign minister or friendly countries, as well as official and unofficial banquets. The Minister of Foreign Affairs welcomed most of his guests in this historic building. He also presided over oath of office ceremony for senior officials, consuls general, as well as ceremony to end foreign service term in the building. The Pancasila building is also often the venue for the breakfast event, or what popular as the foreign policy breakfast. Ministry of Foreign Affairs invite leaders and persons from community group to discuss foreign policy and international relation issues. The foreign policy breakfast reflect a transformation that taking place during Indonesia Reformation period, where the voice of the people is as important as parliament and political parties and non-government governmental organizations. The repurposing of Pancasila building shows that the heritage building, in this case, can be a vehicle to change the way things are perceived as a legacy of the colonial era. Heritage is not always about buildings that have to be utilized because they were built in the past and have distinctive architectural style, but also about historical events that have occurred in the building, have meaning in the formation of Indonesian nation. There are various obstacles faced in renovating and maintaining the Pancasila building. The biggest problem is the lack of historical data related to this building, and the archive stored at the National Archive of Republic of Indonesia or ANRI related to this building contain more information about activities in the Pancasila building when the building was called Volkskrant. There is no specific information describing the condition of the building at the beginning of its establishment in the 19th century or the state of the building in the 20th century, namely after this building functioned as the place for the trial of members of the Dutch East Indies Representative Council. And this lack of information might be overcome if there was more information about the various architectural style applied during this period by the Dutch architects. Comparative data from heritage experts in the Netherlands is needed, as they may have information that is unknown to Indonesian architects who specialize in heritage buildings. Further historical information is also needed about the activities in the early 19th century in this building, when it was the residence of the commander-in-chief of the Dutch East Indies Army. Historical data is also lacking for the period when building was used as the seat of the Volkskrant. The various obstacles in renovating the Pancasila building and efforts to develop a historical narrative that can define the evolution of this building since it was built until now explain that the heritage preservation cannot be done by one party. Immediately emerged in the preservation of the Pancasila building and other heritage building in Jakarta and Indonesia as a whole is the urgency for cooperation between Indonesia and the Netherlands to jointly preserve heritage that has historical significance for both parties. There are many pieces of shared history between Indonesia and the Netherlands, especially for the long colonial period. In this intersecting or shared part of history between the two countries, but a better understanding of history can be gained if both parties are willing to work together to develop better understanding of what was happened in this shared part of history. The case of the Pancasila building shows that the effort to preserve and develop the building function as a historic place for both Indonesia and the Netherlands must be undertaken jointly in order to realize a heritage that not only has historical significance and benefit for Indonesia, but also to the Netherlands and society at large. Yeah, I think that's all that I want to say about the Gedung Pancasila as a heritage building. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm giving back the floor to you. Please.
Thank you so much, Bondan. Now we could go back to the PowerPoint we had previously, because this is a perfect bridge to the final part of our presentation, which is a concept for a summer school us three have devised, have thought out, which will actually stimulate students to reflect on the same types of issues that Bonham just raised, namely what would be the added value of cooperation and more cooperation also regarding heritage in Jakarta between Indonesia and the Netherlands, and what could be the added value of that. we'll present to you the concept we have on the summer school regarding these very same topics, and we would love also to get your input, feedback, perhaps cooperation. So the idea we have now is to let students investigate the representation of the past at monuments, museums, buildings, other institutions, sites that stem from or can be connected to the colonial period. So these sites can be well known and also already repurposed for tourism, such as Kota Tua and the former city hall, built during the VOC era, as also has been shown in Bondan's presentation. But it can also be less known sites, also not really used for touristic purposes, such as the Pancasila building. So these sites, they constitute in part, louder please, okay. These sites in part constitute representations and memories of this complex and shared Dutch-Indonesian past, and also offers a lens through which to study this past, but even more important perhaps, a lens with which to study the representation of this past. What stories are told, what stories are not told, etc. And the idea is to let students critically study the representation of the past, as well as remembrance, commemoration, memory culture, memory practices at these sites from an interdisciplinary perspective. And to do that, we will of course present literature and also expert presentations. So the students will be provided with the opportunity to explore the various ways in which societies in Europe and Asia struggle with and shape the legacies of the past regarding heritage, and struggle with the representation of history regarding colonial heritage. And also with the methodology on how to study representation of the past at heritage sites, memory culture, memory practices, which we will elaborate later on. So to guide the students through all these quite complicated topics, we drafted several draft questions which they have to answer. First, of course, we want students to study these sites comprehensively. So how these buildings are built for that history and then transformed and perhaps repurposed throughout history. And therefore you have to study the site comprehensively. So historically, but also spatially, the spatial makeup of the site, etc. And then the second question is related to the narratives that are told at these sites, which can be visual, textual, oral. Some of these sites are now repurposed as musea or national gallery, and can present a certain narrative of history. But perhaps this varies per site, whether the site is government-owned or privately owned. We will also focus on the oral narratives that are presented by tour guides, textual narratives that are textually present there. We'll also ask the students how much room there is, or how much visitors are invited to critically reflect on these narratives. The third question then is related to memory culture and practices. So besides the narratives that are told at these sites, there's of course also the meanings that people and visitors connect and attach to these sites. And here we then come to the actual memory culture and practices of the peoples and visitors themselves. So by answering these three questions, students are encouraged to critically reflect on the representation of history at these sites, what stories are told, but what stories are also not told, what groups are included, what groups are excluded when it comes to the representation of history at these sites. And of course, for that, we will visit different types of buildings, musea, and offer literature also for the students on how to critically reflect on the representation of past at these sites. And by critically reflecting on these sites, students are also encouraged to develop a sort of policy recommendation regarding the narratives that could be told at these sites, or develop also a recommendation on how heritage should be conserved and repurposed, and by what actors. And regarding these last two questions, we will also invite the students to reflect on what actors are now involved with the heritage management, conservation, repurposement at these sites. And subtly also ask, are these only national actors or also international actors involved? And whether the students think the way it's happening now is sufficient, or whether more, for example, international cooperation is also warranted or expedient. Am I missing anything, Philip?
No, I think that was a very clear overview of what we want to do. And we want to stress that we think that heritage is very important because it's one of the actual remains where we can see how this colonial past was constructed and what stories are told about it. And in that way, it can really shape our connected past, and it can also stimulate cooperation. And that's something that we want to be a little bit of a part of, to see how exchange and cooperation can stimulate a more connected story about the colonial past. So, yeah, thank you, Alex.
All right, then we can go to the next slide. So we drafted a preliminary list of sites and buildings that we can take the students with on a field trip. And of course, if you have any suggestions of what might be added to this, what can be an interesting site, we would love also to hear your input. To give some examples of what we invite the students to reflect on, we can go to the next slide. Boelman already mentioned the Waterloo Square, or the Waterlooplein. As probably many of you know, after the Napoleonic Wars, this square was dedicated to the Battle of Waterloo, which shows how the Dutch colonial officials repurposed this site in Indonesia for a very European event. A Waterloo Association was erected in Batavia by officials, but also ministers, preachers of the church became members of this association. And what they did is commemorate Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo in back then it was Batavia, now it is Jakarta. And they collected money and then erected this monument on the Waterloo Square, which you can see there, the pillar with the Dutch lion on top. And this association did many more things related to Waterloo, commemorating Waterloo in Batavia. For example, they also struck coins and collected money for the injured soldiers involved in the Battle of Waterloo in the Netherlands. So in Batavia, they collected money for the victims of Waterloo and erected more small monuments in Batavia as well. Of course, this was a certain representation of history present at this square. Nowadays, amongst many other things, there is the Irian Jaya monument on the same square. And of course, this invites students then to reflect on how the same site is used to represent very different versions of history. We can let the students reflect on memory practices in the past and also in the present. How was this square used for memory practices in Batavia around 1830, when this around the time when this monument was erected, and what's happening there now? And also invite the students to reflect on what stories could actually be told here, how and which actors should be involved in this. And of course, the similarity between both monuments is somewhat striking. In both cases, a pillar and an icon on top, which we think is very interesting for the students to reflect on. Am I missing anything here? And then the next site is, of course, also well known to many of you, Museum Nationaal in the building of what was erected by the Batavia's Genootschap. Yeah, as many of you know, it's the Batavia's Genootschap founded in the late 18th century, and very quickly officials, but also in many cases church ministers, immediately started collecting items privately. Also in the context of this genootschap, this association, started collecting also artifacts, objects, and in the 19th century, this collection then morphed into a museum. And now it's the Museum Nationaal. And of course, this is also interesting for the students to reflect on what stories were told in the past, what stories are told now, memory practices then and now. This association was an elite association in which high officials, ministers of the church, wealthy citizens became members. And they also held gatherings and events, also to commemorate Waterloo, the Battle for Waterloo, amongst others. Of course, it's interesting then to reflect on memory practices in the past, because these were memory practices in the past. They commemorated Waterloo in Batavia. And what are the memory practices now? What do actually visitors in this museum, national and international, commemorate and about history when they visit this building, and what narratives are they presenting? And of course, then also to develop a policy recommendation and what story could be told, how, and by what actors. And in the same way, we want students, or we now think of inviting the students to reflect on the same questions at many other sites. Let's see, we can go to the next slides. Yeah, so how we think about it now is to divide students into different subgroups, and then every day of the summer school visit one or more different sites, to also present them with expert presentations and literature on heritage, memory studies, also methodology, how to study these sites, how to study texts, visuals, oral history, also, if possible, present them with innovative methodology, digital humanities methods, because of course there's also many digital humanities tools that might be helpful on how to study these sites. Tour guides for museum and sites, of course, are also very important to accompany our experience. And also for the students to study what is the sort of official narrative that is told at these sites. Of course, the goal of this is, when we talked about the shared studying of the past, to actually, with this summer school, contribute to this shared understanding and shared studying of the past. And reflect also on the memory culture and practices in Europe and Asia, and then specifically the Netherlands and Indonesia, see what we can learn from each other, the added value of that. Philip, am I missing anything?
No, I think what we can refer back to is also Bonland's point that it's really this cooperation that is necessary in order to think about these buildings, to think about these objects, and to think about their histories. We also need to access sources that allow us to do so, and it's often only in cooperation that we can actually do so and think about original construction, about the role of the building and what its purpose was. So by collecting these stories and by combining these different ideas, a shared or more shared and more inclusive understanding is possible, we think. And that's something that Blondin has already talked about, but I think it's worth highlighting.
Well, Blondin, did we miss anything that you want to add regarding this summer school?
Yeah, I think for the student who joins this seminar or class, it will be very important also to consult with the archive, not only to look to the buildings or the site, but it is also important to check what the sources says about the role of the building in the context of colonial period and period after that. I think this is very important because there are so many layers of history that perhaps already perceived by people about by people in Jakarta, for example, about the buildings. So I think it is very important also to do research uh, on sources about this heritage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
indeed. Yeah, very good points. Yeah, I think we talked for a very long time now. So now would be a natural moment to go over to the Q&A. Many hands. Yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. Let me introduce myself. I'm Teguh Kurniawan from the University of Indonesia. So I just wonder about how you're concerned about the heritage building, but in the eastern part of Indonesia, for example, because at the time when the Dutch come to Indonesia, England, also another Western country is to find the journey to find spices. And there is a lot of like this kind of building, heritage building, yes, areas such as in Banda Neira, Banda Islands, and surrounding, and also here we have the story about the kings of Ran Island, for example. A lot of heritage building there in the eastern and very, I think it's also very need attention. So about Jakarta and surrounding, yeah, it's also a lot of heritage building. But now in Indonesia, we also have like many community that's run like tourism activities, but by visiting like the cultural heritage and also heritage related to the trains, for example, train station. So they will have like a trip by using train to some station and then yeah, something like that. So for the area in Jakarta and surrounding, I think it's now more attention to it. But how about the attention for the heritage building in the eastern part? So I think it will be interesting to have summer ports in Banda Neira, for example. Yeah, I just wonder about it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bondan, do you have a take on this?
yeah, I think your idea is very good, yeah. But the problem in Indonesia is a distance, yeah. So I think it is not so easy to have this kind of summer school in Banda. The problem of transportation and other things is quite big, yeah. So what we can do in the next future, I think perhaps we can start with the summer school in Jakarta as a pilot project before we can do it in another place in Indonesia. So it become a example, yeah, for other communities that you mentioned to also conduct or to have this kind of summer school, yeah. So they can invite not only expert from Netherlands, but actually they can invite the local experts, yeah. So they can start this kind of effort to preserve all of this heritage soon, not only waiting until the expert from Jakarta or from foreign countries come to Indonesia. Yeah, yeah, Alex.
And Philip, of course, the Moluccas is your area, and you might know a thing or two about heritage there.
No, but I completely agree with what Bonan was saying that it's logistically, of course, quite challenging to organize something like this, but it would be very worthwhile because it's not about just Jakarta. It's about more an inclusive story, I think, everywhere. But our idea was also just practically Jakarta would be quite doable to organize something. There's so many places close together and so many stories to be told. But of course, other places can also be very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, go.
Thank you for your generosity, Grace, and wonderful presentations, and looking forward to the next summer school. When you were showing the Lapangan Banteng, and then when you were about to move to the next, you looked at Philips and then asked, "Am I missing anything here?" And I thought that was a very questions, especially if, since Pak Bondan earlier mentioned that heritage is not always about building. So on that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that on that lapangan banteng stood a massive station, 4 meter high,
Yes.
of young Peterson School, and then it was demolished on the March 7, 1943, by the Japanese colonial rule to win the hearts of the population, the Indonesians, and grow this sentiment against the Dutch. It was proven very fruitful. So the gist of your questions, and somehow you give me the same question, is about absence, right? I wonder if this part of also deconstructing this colonial heritage, we can also define absence in regard to colonial heritage. How do we define presence in the context of colonial structures? And what does it mean when the structure stands as a reminder of the past versus when it is physically absent, but still influential in memory of or identity? How would you?
Fantastic. I think we should just copy this question and use it in the summer school for the students. For the students to critically, because this is a very important question. I wouldn't have an answer to that.
Well, maybe Bondan has an idea of how absence is important in this regard. When you look at your own work, Bondan, and your own ideas about heritage.
Can you explain again the question? I cannot catch clearly the question.
Could you repeat the question?
So how do we define them? I wonder if, since you mentioned that colonial heritage is not always about building, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And then, I was reminded. I was reminded of something, which is the absence of, for example, massive colonial statues and also buildings that were no longer there, but then the memory of it still lives on. I wonder if that is what is actually meant by the what the notions of colonial heritage doesn't have to be always tangible or present. So problematize the absence in the context of colonial heritage and redefinition of it, which also the students at the summer school could also reflect on.
Yeah, definitely.
Because absence also says a lot about traces, right?
Oh, sorry, I cannot catch the idea of your question. Perhaps, Philip, you can explain to me.
I think can you understand me, Bondan?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Yes, I think the question is about absence, so things that are not there, things that are removed, things that maybe.
Yeah. There are so many heritage. I think is not already existed anymore in Indonesia. What is exist and what is not existed, I think they have the same meaning as they are the same important, as a historical as a history site. So I think it is also a topic that could be very interesting for the student of summer school, to also thinking about what kind of thing that make this kind of site missing or demolished or something else. So I think it is good to discuss, because now in Jakarta a lot of old building and also heritage is not safe, because a lot of activities, especially in economic side, economic activities, that become more important, than the preserving a historical site. So this is a kind of problem that we have to solve together, I think, not only as a historian, but also as a citizen of Jakarta, for example, like that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And indeed, we studied the representation of the past, and if colonial heritage is not there anymore, that also invites students to reflect on, okay, what does this say about the representation of the past when it's not there anymore, and if it was on purpose or not, or
Yeah. For example, one of the most important heritage in Indonesia that already not existed anymore is the house when we are proclaim our independence. Yeah, in Jalan in Jalan Pegangsaan Timur, or now Jalan Proklamasi in central of Jakarta. If we go to that place now, there is no building that can remind us about the event of uh, our proclamation on 17 August 1945. This is the most important event in Indonesian history, the proclamation of independence by Sukarno and Hatta. But unfortunately, the site is already missing at all. There is no nothing in the site, only the statue of Sukarno and Hatta. The house that become the place for the proclamation is not existing anymore. This is, I think, one of, and the house is actually is built uh, among other houses in the Menteng complex. These houses have architectural style as a Dutch houses. So this is also kind of heritage that already not existing anymore, but it has a lot of meaning for Indonesian history.
It's very
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah,
Perhaps also one of the sites we can bring the students to.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So if you go to Indonesia now, it is difficult to find the proof that we have already proclaimed our independence in 17 August 1945, because the house of Sukarno, where the proclamation took place, is not already existed anymore. We can go there to bring our student to, yeah, to think.
Why unfortunate?
Did you hear the question, Bondan? The question from the audience is, why is that unfortunate?
Yeah, because that is the most important place where we are proclaim our independence. Indonesia independence in 17 August 1945 took place in front of the house of Sukarno in Jalan Pegangsaan Timur number 56. But now the house already demolished, not existing anymore. And in the place where the house before is existing, now only a statue of Sukarno and Hatta. I think this is one of the important case, yeah, that can tell us about how important actually the site is that already not exist anymore. Yeah,
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe it's time for our next question.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I have a very troubling question. I think I will start with the point that you are making about heritage as claim making. I think that resonates quite well in the presentation. But then I became a bit confused when looking at the plan for the summer course and the choices of the heritage sites, which brings me to question, why do we start with sites for heritage that are built by the colonial elites? So if you start by the point that the summer school will be something inclusive between Indonesia and the Netherlands, this brings also the question, how are we placing ourselves in this inclusivity if starting with heritage sites built by the colonials, which I think still puts colonial as the center in that case, although you've also mentioned how the meanings are changed, etc. But I was also thinking that within those same periods, there are other people who are living in the same sites in the same period that have different narratives. I'm thinking, for example, within the compound of the Fatahillah Museum, there are also Chinese residents who build temples, their own residential areas, coffee shop that also resonates with the term heritage in their own narratives. So this also brings the question: what does it mean? What does colonial heritage mean? Is it something that are built by the colonials, or is it something that it's a claim making that emerged from colonialism? So. And you also mentioned about policy recommendation. how can the policy recommendation be inclusive if we start with the colonial-centric heritage in the first place? So why not also include sites and buildings built by the locals, the Chinese schools, Chinese coffee shops, residential areas, or even the kampung, the fisherman kampung in Penjaringan, North Jakarta, for example. So I think the choices and the concepts of this colonial heritage we can discuss and expand it a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, but it's just a preliminary setup that we and it's also, I mean, these buildings are still very important, even though they were sort of built, of course, by a colonial elite. They are still very much present, and it's also something that connects these buildings. So we were also looking for something like a connecting theme, where we can also have a sort of a role in that as Dutch historians. So that's why I think many of these buildings and sites were chosen. But it's something that is still very preliminary, and I think it's a great point that you're raising about decentering the elite perspective and the importance of that. So that's something we'll definitely take into account.
Yeah, I think also the claim that buildings are important is also very debatable and very
of course,
right?
So
I thought we had at least Lodok on the list, but I don't know if that's maybe vague. Yeah, but it's indeed a very good point, and we should. We're very open to hearing suggestions from you and from the audience on how to make this list more, in a way also more really inclusive, like you mentioned, not only oriented on the colonial elites and what they did, but of course, I think maybe the questions you're raising is also what we hope to also raise with the students, like who built these buildings. It were local people, and the meanings that also maybe local people attached to these buildings and sites are as important, or maybe more important, than what the colonial elites wanted to do with those buildings. So yeah, indeed. Yeah. Bondan, did you hear the questions?
Yeah, I can hear. Yeah, that is a good idea, because colonialism is not only about the elite. Yeah, I think we also have to edit some building or many buildings that have a meaning in the different way, not only that have a direct connection with the elite, but also maybe perhaps ordinary buildings that actually existed everywhere in Jakarta and everywhere in Indonesia. For example, like the house that belong to the ordinary people, that perhaps can reflect kind of history that not so popular, but that is important for local people. So I think this idea is a very important to be included in our summer school, Phillips and Alex. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Or what about everywhere in the Netherlands, starting from that was built after the end of the 16th century? Then also people consider that somewhat colonial heritage.
Yeah, that's a good question, but that's something obviously you can take into account, I think, as a sort of a background and part of the literature, but that's not something we would center or foreground when you're in Jakarta. But it's definitely, I mean, it is a shared past, so I think you're very right in that sense.
And it's definitely a good discussion question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, very interesting. Well, how are we doing with the time? Because we saw 10 minutes, 15 minutes, but 10 minutes? Okay, then we can have a few more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, it's really interesting. One with colonial heritage restoration, and another one is about building some school out of it. I have a few questions, like very practical. I was wondering, how do you imagine how long the summer school will take place, and then what sort of preparation? Seems like the question that you do the student and the expectation at the end of the summer school, which is policy recommendation, is pretty. I don't imagine having an undergraduate student do a policy recommendation within the span of 2 weeks of summer school is doable. I just wonder, to what extent that you have already prepared this, and what kind of students that you expect to participate in this?
Yeah, good question. I think how we think about it now is to already compile a reader of literature which students have to study before the school. A quite extensive reader, and we expect them to really study that before the summer school, so they're already aware of all the relevant literature on memory culture, heritage management, studying representation of the past at sites of learning heritage and memory.
And then, of course, compiling the sources is also a challenge for you, especially with the, in Indonesia, you won't be able to have extensive resources about this particular building, who built this, and all this history of restoration and stuff.
Yeah. So I think you raise very good points, which we definitely have to take into consideration when we make the plan for the summer school more tangible. But I think our idea was to take around 1.5 to 2 weeks for the summer school.
Like 10 days.
Yeah, something like that, with extensive preparation. And I think when it comes to the sources and everything, we might also have to do some pre-work to already pre-select stuff for the students to work with. Yeah, because if they have to find everything themselves, it's might be involved. Yeah.
Again, it ends up with whose narrative that you're pairing your students with, right?
That's definitely. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Remco Meule. I'm very interested in hearing your plans for this summer school, not at least because it very much connects to my own PhD research. So for me, if this summer school materializes, I would like to join forces so your students can do part of my research work in data collection. But more a practical question. Did you already collect like the funding for this summer school? Like how feasible is it for this summer school to materialize, and when will be the first edition of training?
Yeah, so we've collected part of the funding also from our own university budget and different possibilities there. And we're also looking for some more funding. And our idea would be, I think, next summer, right?
Yeah. That's basically, but if anybody has funding,
It's everyone's
I mean, this is still a preliminary stage, we have to admit, and we still have to, I think, make a really tangible budget, and then start really looking for, the funding we need.
I will definitely contact you for not for money, but Okay, great. Maybe the final question.
The question is, what is the value for the students participating in this? What would be their takeaway?
I think that's a good question. So basically, the idea would be to gain practical experience in deconstructing these buildings, so learning about the stories that are told, connecting them to a set of concepts, connecting them to archival documents, learning about, what was the intention behind the building and how has the narrative changed over time, and learning to apply these concepts and use them in a very concrete way, either through archival work or doing oral research to talk about, to people to think about, what's the sort of the current story, and connecting these different methodologies. That would be, I think, a great takeaway.
Ondan, you have anything to add to this?
I think I agree with Philips. Yeah, enough.
Okay, then thank you all for coming here. I'm available to talk to us further.